Hello, welcome to Hope in the Light of Suicide. I'm Tammy White. I'm the founder of the Bobby White Foundation. I'm here along with my wonderful co-hosts.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Bonnie Snyder. Welcome.
Welcome, everyone. Um, Last week I had mentioned a website, grief.com,
Hmm.
and some in some of that area, there's a place where you can make comments, and a woman um, left the link to a website to an article I thought was really interesting. So I want to dive into that here in just a moment. But first, I want to thank John and Rob at WeBeam TV for doing all that they do for our show and for us. Their support is tremendous. And if you want to support us, you can support us through our Kindness webpage. There's all levels of support from $5 to 25,000. You take care of our show for a year. But and there's also a place where you can just put in whatever amount you feel comfortable doing. And there's the site there. You can either get to it through that QR code or through the BobbyWhiteFoundation.org website. And we have our T-shirts also, our first Hope T-shirts that are kind of reminiscent for our Purple Folder program. And I did send a information to Gulfside Custom T-shirts for the design of our second T-shirt.
Nice.
And
Can't
so
wait for those.
hopefully we'll be having those available pretty soon. Those are going to be really neat ones too. So,
One thing we didn't mention?
what is that?
That painting.
Oh, I'm probably going to go ahead and run that through July. But yeah, we do have that painting that Carol Smith donated to the foundation. The title is Hope Rains Down, and you can find it on the Bobby White Foundation Facebook page. And the starting bid is only $55. It's a 20 by 20 original canvas, and the proceeds will go to the foundation. But I think I'm going to continue. We've had it run through June, and I'm going to continue it through the end of July, and maybe not in July. I think in August. We're gonna when we have so many exciting things getting ready to happen, and kind of don't know where we're gonna be at. We're gonna be moving the studio hopefully here shortly, and have more room. We're gonna bring stuff on set. We're going to start Art for Hope in September, so we're going to start bringing art and sculptures to have on set with us throughout from September 1st to the first Thursday of November, which is not the first Thursday, the Thursday prior to Thanksgiving, which is Suicide Loss Survivors Day. So there's a lot going on, and trying to keep this straight in our heads is kind of wacky sometimes.
Well, as we're navigating, all of these moving parts, like you said, with the studio moving, and then everything that we have going on with that, we're also, navigating out of a pandemic back to some semblance of normal. And so what does that look like as, I'm not going to say distancing restrictions being lifted, because we continue to practice, social distancing, but as the CDC guidelines changes, and the mask mandates are updated and changed and whatnot, of course that's going to change how and what, or not so much what we are doing, but how we are doing it.
Yeah, and I think nobody anticipated kind of, and probably not everybody feels this way, the difficulty of reversing what we've been doing in the last year and a half.
Yeah, when something becomes, second, normal, second, commonplace, I'm, went from, for me, I didn't change how I did things too much, per se, because, I worked pre-pandemic kind of hybrid anyway. Although, a lot of stuff that I did in person, yes, curtailed for a while. But you do have a point there, as we navigate from, we've been so used to being virtual, and, isolated for the last year and a half now. It's funny. I find myself, going into, like, whether it's a market or something, a grocery store, and I'm like, where are the masks at? No one's wearing masks. Then I'm like, wait a minute, but Bonnie, you're not wearing a mask either. And it's like, oh, but wait a minute, I'm vaccinated, so, I can, the science says I can do this. But I do find myself, but let me make sure I have my mask just in case.
Yeah, I always have one in my purse.
Yes.
I don't typically wear it that much anymore because I'm vaccinated too, but I do always have one in my purse just in case. Because there are some places that are still requiring you to wear masks in the store, especially if they're small shops, things like that. And it's not hard to be respectful of that.
And no, it isn't. It isn't. I was talking to, I was going into my office day before yesterday, I'm sorry. And, no, let me take it back. It was yesterday. I was going into my office, for a little bit, and the security guard, that works at the front, we're chit-chatting for a minute. And at first, he looks at me. Because usually when I go in, I've got, 18 briefcases, it's like my rolling bag and, multiple. And I walked in with nothing in my hand, and he's looking at me like, where's your stuff at? I'm supposed to open the door for you. Very sweet guy. We started talking about, things going back to normal and, wearing masks, like in our offices, because there's a tendency that there are other individuals, patients, clients, whatever you want to call them. We tend to mask up when we're in the hallway. But now from my desk, mask take off. But yeah, it is going to be interesting to see as we navigate back to, and what was life like before COVID. But many of us are still going to have a mask close by.
Mm-hmm. Well, and like the event that we were at recently, nobody was wearing masks.
And it was not a lot of social distancing going on either.
No, there wasn't. And everybody was just so excited to see everybody. It's, but hey.
And I think for me, it wasn't so much that, I wasn't so much that I was totally worried about myself, because as I'm walking around and, oh my gosh, I haven't seen you in a while, and connecting with, new people, in my head, I'm like, are you vaccinated? Here it's vaccinated. It's like, well, okay, according to the science, I'm safe because I'm vaccinated. But are you vaccinated? How many of us are unmasked and we're not vaccinated? We're just unmasked because we're tired of the mask. But anyway, we got off on a tangent there.
Yeah, all's good.
Yes, it is. We do this. This is, unscripted, folks. We're totally unscripted.
Yeah. Sometimes you just never know.
If you haven't noticed, we're not scripted. So.
I am, like I said, I mentioned I'd found this article, and I found this kind of interesting, and then we'll go back into our book, and I think we're going to cover guilt today.
Right.
And actually, it kind of falls in with this because, a couple months ago we had, was it the minister?
Oh, Greg and Jennifer.
Yeah, and talked about how different faiths deal with suicide.
Yes.
And I think, and I could be wrong, but because I'm not like attached to one faith,
Mm-hmm.
but my husband he was raised Catholic,
Mm-hmm.
and Catholic religion, seems to me one of the more strict religions.
Rigid.
Yeah, rigid. That's a good term for it. But when I was looking on the website, grief.com, and this gal posted a link to this article, and it's written by a Catholic minister or Catholic priest. And his name is Ron. I'm gonna just butcher his last name. I think Ron Rolheiser.
I think it's pronounced Rollheiser.
Rolheiser.
Mhm.
Okay. Hopefully, I didn't do too bad with that. But the title of the article is "Suicide: The Most Misunderstood of All Deaths." Uh, this minister, or priest, he has written several articles. He's a very prolific writer. He writes an article, I think, every week for some news outlet or something. And he's been doing it for several years. And every year he does an article um, directly taking on the task of suicide. And I thought it was really interesting. I did print out some of the other articles back to 2015. I didn't go any further back than that, but we'll highlight some of those as we go on. But he says here, death is always painful, but its pains are compounded considerably if its cause is suicide. When a suicide occurs, we aren't just left with the loss of a person. We're also left with a legacy of anger, second-guessing, and fearful anxiety. So he goes on to say here, he writes a column on suicide every year, hoping it might produce more understanding around the issue, in a small way perhaps, offer some consolation to those who have lost a loved one to this dreadful disease. Essentially, I say the same things each year because they need to be said. As Margaret Atwood once put it, some things need to be said and said and said again until they don't need to be said anymore. That's true of suicide.
As I read this article, this was, we talked about last week about reading stuff and you have this aha moment where, something that strikes you, either it, speaks to, a personal experience, it speaks to, what we're processing, or that is something that needs to be said. And what I liked about this is when, it says what needs to be said and said again about it. First of all, that it is a disease and perhaps the most misunderstood of diseases. And, as I read that, I took like a mini pause because, as we talk about, the topics, and the issues and things that we talk about, every week, and putting those different perspectives on it. I mean, for myself, there is, a little bit of a multifaceted, perception or lens that I look at these things through. Of course, I don't want to say first and foremost, because it's difficult to put them in, well, if I put it in this perspective is more important than this perspective. And so that multifaceted lens includes, the personal experience, from, my own personal journey through, the loss of, Aiden and Patrick. And then I look at that experience that I have, from, friends, or family members who have lost someone, and, processing it through their experience. And I think, for me, the bridge between the two is being a mental health professional, and looking at, well, as I'm processing through my stuff, or am I processing through my stuff through someone else's experiences or vice versa? We have, fancy terms in mental health, transference, countertransference. Am I dealing with my stuff through my clients or I don't do clients. I don't, I shouldn't say it like that, but my work in mental health is a little different right now. Like I don't do traditional therapy, just to say, mine is more broad. But anyway, or the people that I'm working with, processing, projecting what they're feeling onto me, like, you remind me of mom, and I'm gonna, react to you like mom, or vice versa. You remind me of Uncle Bob. But for the author to say that suicide is a disease, and a very misunderstood disease, I sat back and I was like, thank you. I'm not sure that I ever looked at it through that lens before. But thank you.
I hadn't either, but he lines it out of here. Where is it? Here, I'll just read this here. We tend to think that if a death is self-inflicted, it is voluntary in a way that death through physical illness or accident is not. For most suicides, this isn't true. The person who falls victim to suicide dies, as does the victim of a terminal illness or fatal accident, not by his or her own choice. And there have been a ton of interviews done with people who have attempted and survived. And one of the main things that is usually said with all of them is they really didn't want to die.
No, it was, I want to stop the pain. And, death was the only tool, the only thing in my arsenal, the only thing that was at my disposal to stop the pain. And, again, I like the way, he laid this out in the article, in that, when we lose someone through, an illness or an accident, it is that wasn't, that wasn't their choice. They didn't choose to get sick. They didn't choose that, that accident or crash. That was beyond their control. Mm-hmm. And it does set up that misperception that suicide is a choice, and it's within someone's control.
Well, let's see, and I kind of deal with this with Bobby because, he had multiple sclerosis. He had been diagnosed for 25 years, and we kind of figure it probably, the onset of it was probably about 3 years prior to that. Mm-hmm. And so with a disease that you don't know what kind of track it's going to take, we had no idea what was, our lives were going to be like. Fortunate, we took his health, very seriously, and he had remitting, relapsing MS, and but throughout those years, I always knew that he wasn't going to get better from this, and just kind of knew in the back of my head that but probably when I would lose him, it would be to complications from his MS. Mm-hmm. I could myself rationalize just for myself that I could deal with that a whole lot easier than him taking his life.
Yeah, and again, a lot of it, as Mr. Rolheiser puts in, the article, is because how we process when someone dies by suicide. You made a conscious effort to, whatever method you used.
But that's our thinking. That's not theirs.
Correct. Absolutely correct. You're taking, you're reading my mind here, buddy. You're reading my mind. Because it's like, yes, when I think about, how Bobby passed, how Aiden passed, and even I'm, going to include how Patrick passed. You you're right. They were, and I'm going to use the words very loosely because I'm going to say, in control, or made the choice to, you know, um, affix the belt. Um, with Patrick, I don't know whether, it was, a needle injection or, whether it was ingested or injected. So I mean, I was in control of whatever that object was at the moment. However, we don't think about, but I'm not in control up here.
Exactly.
It is the same thing with, as he talks here, when we lose somebody, or we're dealing with an illness, I, I think about, for example, after one of my surgeries, I was on a cancer journey, I think what we shared here. And, I'm like lying there and I'm thinking to myself, okay, I'm getting through this. And I remember, having this button in my hand for the medication. And, I was like, well, wait a minute, Bonnie, how does this equate to this? And I'm like, because people looked at it, it's like, I was in control of that button. Like, there's just like, hey, so we don't have to come in and, administer you meds. You can self-administer. So you control when you get this meds. And I'm like, okay. But I remember asking the nurse, well, what happens if I, I fall asleep and have this button in my hand and I automatically push it? And, she's like, don't worry about it. It's monitored, so I could push this button 1,000 times and it would not administer more medication than, what I couldn't overdose. So how does this link to or in control? Because that button was a way for me to decrease and manage the pain that I was feeling after the surgery. Okay, and I mean it was, like I said, it was major, major. It was very huge tumors that they took out of me. And I remember telling me, I'm like, huh? What? It was that. But anyway, it's like I could. So it became a thing of, if I was in a lot of pain, I could push this button and take away my pain, diminish the pain or make the pain manageable. If I wasn't in a lot of pain, I didn't have to push the button. And someone who is dealing with, a suicidal ideation, I equate that much to at the time that they took their life, their finger was on that button. I'm in pain, and I need to stop the pain. And I'm going to metaphorically administer this dose to stop the pain. And I feel if we're able to take a step back and look at it through that lens of how different is that than the person, than the patient in the hospital who is dealing with whatever it is they're dealing with, who either can self-administer or hits a call button to tell the nurse, can you bring me something for pain?
Exactly. And he says here, a person who falls victim to suicide dies, as does the victim of a terminal illness or fatal accident, not by his or her own choice. When people die from heart attacks, stroke, cancer, AIDS, and accidents, they die against their will. The same is true suicide, except that in the case of suicide, the breakdown is emotional rather than physical. An emotional stroke, an emotional cancer, a breakdown of the emotional immune system, and emotional fatality.
And that's a key word right there. I mean, I like that when he said it is an emotional fatality. Because it is very much, I not that I can't, we don't, it's hard sometimes to deal in absolute, I can't do this, what I can and what I cannot do. I like to put it more in a context of, it's not that I can't do it, it is at the moment I don't have the necessary strategies, coping mechanisms, resources to deal with what is going on right now.
And you have to remember, too, that more often than not, it's not one thing.
You're right. You are so right.
And I think this is where it comes down to the more difficulty of dealing with the emotions. Either you're getting bombarded from all sides and, it's just too much, or this happened, and then right after this happened, and now this is happening again. I just can't do that. And it's not typically one event or one reason that somebody takes their life.
Yeah, it's like that proverbial, my cup is overflowing or my bucket is overflowing. And, if I remember correctly, when Rod Cunningham was on, a few weeks back, where he talked about, that very same thing that, people think it, to your point, it is that one thing. And, I wish I could remember all of the examples that he, put out, but he was like, let's say, you get up in the morning and you're getting ready for work, and, the shoes that you want to wear, or I think about this morning when I'm getting dressed for work, I was like, I think I want to wear these slacks. And I put on this particular pair of slacks, and I'm like, you're joking me, right? Like, you're joking me. I can't fit these slacks. So I'm like, oh, Bonnie, what have you done? You can't fit these slacks. And, like, I love these slacks. And that's like, all right, so now I got to figure something different to wear. So now I'm kind of mini stressed out because, I've got to find something different in the closet to wear because I really planned on wearing that particular pair of slacks or that particular outfit. And then you go and you get in the car and it's like, oh, darn it, I forgot to put gas in the car. So now my stressometer has gone up a little bit more because, well, now I've got to be at this place at this time, and, I have to make this unplanned stop, to, put gas in my car. And then, you get to work and there's a business meeting and, somebody in the business meeting says something to you, like, now I got to deal with that. So much like, using, these things that...
The bucket keeps getting full,
exactly.
And there's no release valve.
Until finally, and I think Rod said, there's no release valve at the bottom. And then after a while, you're looking at all it takes is one more drop. Right. It doesn't even have to be something major. It could be one little drop. Like, I remember I made a comment we were talking last week. Tammy didn't invite me to lunch. It could be that simple as like, wow, I didn't go to lunch with Tammy, and that's all it takes. I'm in this emotional overload, and there's nothing I can do, or the only thing I feel I have at my disposal is, I'm checking out.
Yeah. He also, again, going back with the other illnesses, heart attacks, strokes, cancers, breakdowns of the immune systems, accidents, fatal accidents. He says are identical, that in either case, the person leaving this world was on the basis of a voluntary decision of his or her own will. You have this illness. You didn't will upon yourself, and then you have to look at suicide that way too, because, and that's what he says here, is that in both cases he or she is taken out of life against his or her own will. And then I like how I've never seen it written or said like this before, but he says that's why we speak of someone as a victim of suicide.
You're right, correct. And again, he puts it there so eloquently, because when I think of, like, for instance, in the cancer journey, walking into Moffitt, and I'm looking at, the people whose, cancers were, far more advanced than mine. And, just chatting with her. Or I'll use my cousin, who had a very, very aggressive breast cancer. I'm quite sure that, she did not, like we all want to go, so you know what? I think I want to be ill. I want a disease, cancer. I think I want that one. Yeah, give me some cancer. And it's not like walking into a grocery store and you're looking at, or, going into a restaurant and it's like, oh, what's on the menu? I think I want to order this,
Right.
No, I'm quite sure that she did not go in and look at the menu and say, hey, you know what? I think I want that, Now, unfortunately, we lost her, to this, the disease of cancer. Or, when I think of, Bobby or Aiden, I don't think, that they're at that same restaurant and say, you know what, I think today I'm going to end my life. Just because, I'm not really thinking about my wife that I'm leaving behind. I'm not thinking about my fur babies. They'll be just fine. Or in Aiden's case, I'm not thinking about my mom, who's going to find me. Or, my dad
His dad.
but unfortunately, again, when it comes to suicide, we talked about anger. They talked about the emotion of anger last week, and where how some people are angry at that victim of suicide, that person who took their lives. How could you do this to me? And I sit back and I think about when we're processing, how could you do this to me? There is that inward guilt. What did I miss that I didn't stop it?
Oh, yeah.
Well, how did I not know that this was going to happen? How did I miss the signs? And sometimes, like in any disease, or that should be like I'm going to call it maybe even like a glaring neon sign that sometimes when someone is struggling, and at the verge or even contemplating suicide, the signs are not there. Like, there's not this big sign up here flashing that's saying, I'm going to take my life on,
Right.
at this particular day, at this particular time. Sometimes it takes for someone to just sit back and acknowledge, hey, I think you're going through something. I remember sharing the cashier, at the neighborhood market, who, I can't see my face, or I don't know what expression I have on my face, and all it took was, are you okay? You look like something's up. And I'm looking at her like, what? Like in my head, I'm like, did she just ask me if I'm okay? But needless to say, that is all it took. Now, mind you, it wasn't, suicide wasn't, I wasn't processing, I think I'm going to end my life. But I was dealing with the fact that I just got handed a heavy blow. It's a really devastating news about my health, which, for all we know, could have been that last drop in my bucket. But it's this need also to destigmatize, destigmatize suicide in itself, destigmatizing the language, and I find that we are headed in that direction where we're starting, by this platform, normalizing the conversations, having people understand that there are places where they can have, difficult conversations in safe spaces. Letting people understand that, you know, what you're feeling and what you're going through is very normal.
Exactly. Well, and since this article was done by, was written by this Catholic priest, because they're part of, I guess, in some cases, part of the stigma is the religious part of it, or the faith. You're people. People still say, "Oh, they killed themselves. They're going to go to hell."
Eternal damnation.
Yeah, and he says here that given the fact that that someone is a victim of suicide, that we shouldn't worry unduly about the internal salvation of the victim, believing as we used to that suicide is always an act of ultimate despair. God is infinitely more understanding than we are, and God's hands are infinitely safer and more gentle than our own. Imagine a loving mother having just given birth, welcoming her child onto her breast for the first time. That, I believe, is the best image that we have available to understand how a suicide victim, most often an overly sensitive soul, is received into the next life. And he says, again, this isn't an analogy. God is definitely more understanding, loving, and motherly than any mother on earth.
We're cautious, and mindful to recognize that not everyone, believes in God.
Exactly.
Not everyone believes in, an afterlife. Not everyone believes in, there's a heaven and there's a hell, and this, eternal damnation. I mean, I've talked to many of folks who, when you're gone, you're gone. That's it. There's just this life and there's nothing after. This whole concept of, of a God, just, it doesn't exist. So as we're talking about, suicide and, how it affects people's beliefs, again, I think it is important, that we do acknowledge that, this particular topic is not applicable to everyone. And it's not by any way designed to be a disrespect to those who do not believe. At the same time, as we educate and talk about these topics, that part of society that does believe in God and does worship or their higher power is God. This is a sticking point for them, because it becomes I'm never going to see my loved one again because they've died by suicide, and that is the ultimate sin. Many times I've heard people say, but there's one of the 10 commandments is thou shalt not kill. You killed yourself. You just violated, a commandment. And I remember, speaking to individuals from, the faith community after, both, Pat and Aiden's deaths, mind you. And I was thinking, specifically, if I focus on Aiden just for a moment, he was a baby. He was 14. Mm-hmm. Are you going to tell me that my sweet, beautiful grandson is condemned because of how he left this earth? And I remember it might have been our guest Greg who said, Bonnie, we hear this a lot. But if you resort to what your beliefs are, there's only one thing that will stop, that, is condemnation. And he explains what, if you do this one thing, basically cancel Christmas, heaven is not happening for you. And I sat back and I had to think about this because I'm like, you have a point. Because, well, what about, the baby who is stillborn? Are you telling me, that, well, they haven't experienced it, they haven't even processed thought. How do they get to heaven? Because he makes there are concessions. Again, I don't want to. I'm not going to get preachy here. I'm not a minister, but he stretches them out. I don't even play one on TV. I'm just saying. But whatever your belief system is in terms of what happens after when someone dies by suicide, and this, like I said, this article, for me anyway, hit it home in a lot of different ways. Again, back to the very beginning of it, where it talks about suicide is a disease.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So again, creating that language that is destigmatized and looks at it as a disease, as a mental health issue, rather than you selfish individual. Well, how could you do this to me? I almost said something on TV that I should. You selfish individual, and how could you do this to me? And you were in control, and I don't believe you did this. And how could you do this to me? How could you do this to yourself? How could you do this to your loved ones? It's not about you, of the loved ones. Let's focus on what was going on when they chose to do this. And, unfortunately, excuse me, unfortunately, we may never know.
Yeah.
It's not like, so Bobby, I'll have a conversation with you, dude. So what was going on? Like, what? Talk,
Yeah.
talk to me about this. What were you thinking? Or Aiden, what's up? Like, help me understand this. Like, what were you thinking, dude? Patrick, what was going through your mind? Like, and again, I'm not talking about how did you do this to me. I thought you were stronger than this. What was that last drop for you? Help me understand. Help us understand. Instead of, I'm never going to see them again. Never going to experience this again.
Never going to see him, never going to really truly know the answers to all the questions.
And along with that, when we talk about, this, eternal, damnation for the person who, died by suicide, those who are believers, I will put myself in this category. Lord, why me?
Mm-hmm.
What have I done? What am I being punished for? Especially when it's like Aiden and now Patrick, or again, going back to Greg and Jennifer, I love the way Jennifer put it. God, we had a conversation about this. Like, what's going on, dude? Like, help me out here.
I've had those conversations too. Yeah. I don't know. It's, yeah. Well, I kind of going to transition here, which I think it kind of is part of it also, is for those of us left behind, the guilt.
Mm-hmm.
And that even fall into whatever possibly religious beliefs that you have. Even though, I think that if we look at it in our right mind, was nothing that we were going to do.
So yeah, anyway, as we're transitioning into this topic of guilt, I recall thinking I didn't know who wrote this passage that starts this chapter, and it's Reinhold Newbold who was a theologian and a philosopher. And the expression goes, and many of you might recognize it. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And most of us, who are, either in, mental health work or, a lot of my work is focused on, substance addiction. We recognize this expression from, people who are attending AA and A meetings. I like that it was used to begin this chapter on guilt. Because if I sit back and think about, I have to accept the fact that the person who's gone is gone. I can change how I respond, or process through the loss. But sometimes it's that wisdom of knowing the difference, and not so much the difference between this person is gone and how I react to it, but more what I can change, or what I'm willing to accept, and what I'm able to change. If that makes sense.
Well, I think, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of difficult because, even still I have, some of those feelings, even though, if we really think about it in our right mind, we weren't going to change the outcome.
No, I think Carl said it best, or as one of the best responses that I've heard to that was when Carl had said, if, using Aiden, if his friend would have said something, to Mom, or did she, and that's, I don't know if she did, but I'm going to presume, Aiden said, first of all, did she see the picture? Let me back up that more, because I don't want to sound like I'm blaming, this child for what happened. But we know that Aiden sent a picture, of himself in his closet prior to, him taking his life. If this friend would have saw the picture, taken the picture to Mom, Mom would have alerted, Kira, hey, go to your son's room right now. This is what's going on. Would it have been, and I'm going to paraphrase Carl, would we have delayed it by a week? Would we have delayed it by, a day? Would we have delayed it by another year? We don't know. Versus, and I could say the same thing with, Pat, despite the numerous conversations, that I had with him, was that the inevitable outcome? And, to your point, could we have stopped it?
Well, and I deal with that too with Bobby, that day. If I wouldn't have left for 2 hours to go get the truck fixed and pick up the DVD recordings of our wedding that day, I was only gone for 2 hours, and I think, and it's just natural that, but it's I guess it's learning to get over the guilt that you naturally feel, because, it's not what we did or didn't do.
Mm-hmm.
One of my sister-in-laws, she was going to stop by the house that morning, and she was just kind of on autopilot and went through the light and said, I'll come by another day. Would it have stopped it that day? Like you said, it would have happened another day.
Mm-hmm.
She talks to someone, and that person said, to try and, I guess, ease the guilt that she feels, that, which she shouldn't, that, maybe it would have stopped it that day. But it more than likely would have happened another day.
Right. And I like what, she says here, where she says, thinking you caused the loss is a huge responsibility, a burden that no one should carry. And, you sit back and think about it, like, you know, this is somehow my fault. I should have, and we talk about, those in the realm, the coulda, the shoulda, the woulda. If I only could have been there, if I only would have seen this, if I only should, I should have seen that. I should, like, I know I struggle with that a lot with, and I think back to that one question that was asked, given your profession, how did this happen to you? And it's like, because it doesn't discriminate. It doesn't, there's not a, none of us has a, and I think of Wonder Woman and those magic bracelets. None of us has, the magic bracelets. None of us has a force shield around us. But she goes on to say, what does guilt look or feel like? Regret. And shouldn't have got on the plane. Shouldn't have, shouldn't have made those.
Shouldn't have made that second stop.
Exactly. Self-blame. I found this one interesting, and again, doing some self-reflection, I was like, what are this? Fears, anxiety, insecurity, punishing yourself, increased critical thoughts, feeling worthless. When I look at, avoiding enjoyment, I was like, all right, that one makes sense. Focusing on the finality of life, becoming passive in interactions, avoiding conflict, attempting to be a perfect person. And if I go back to, focusing on that finality of life, that one, it also, was huge because, especially in the case of, losing a child, no parent is supposed to bury a child, or so they say. Children are supposed to, and I found myself, especially with guilt, thinking of my children going in and like changing beneficiaries on, insurance policies, or, who is going to be responsible for what, and I'm thinking about, my insurance policy was 33 and a third, 33 and a third, 30,
Right.
Carl, Jean, Patrick, all it's going to, split. To go in now and, change that designation and remove Patrick's name. Now it's, do I change it 50-50 between my two remaining, surviving children? Or do I leave that 33 and a third to Patrick, and then by default, it would go to his children? But then it's like, but wait a minute, what about the other, what about the other kids? It's, so much that we do, like, I shouldn't have to be doing this, yet here I am. We shouldn't have to be doing this, but here we are. It's an eye-opener. It puts things into a totally different perspective for us in terms of, how we approach not only, everyday things, but for me especially, how I approach my work.
Yeah, being in the field that you're in. And in this chapter, she has a work area where you can write, I'm overwhelmed by guilt. I feel guilty about, and then why I shouldn't feel this way. But real quickly, because we're getting close to the end again, I wanted to get to coping with guilt. In the face of guilt, doing for others can provide solace and a needed boost of self-acceptance. Help someone else. Can you volunteer or help a neighbor? Write a letter to the person you lost, explaining why you feel guilty.
I use that one a lot.
Yeah.
When I'm doing grief groups, that's when I use a lot.
I think
write a letter.
A lot. That is utilized a lot. Talk to a trusted person. Often just talk about your guilt. Saying it out loud can help us realize our actual part in the loss, or not.
I like this one. Finish unfinished business when you can, even if it no longer matters. If you're upset that you forgot to buy their favorite cereal, buy it and donate it. If you missed their birthday, celebrate it now. And that one hit for me because, as you guys know, Patrick's birthday was last week, and we celebrate his birthday. But we're at our last minute. And always, thanking, WeBeam TV, our viewers, for tuning in every week.
Yeah, we appreciate it, really more than you know. And also just, watch out for each other. Please put the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline in your cell phone. And then for veterans, press 1. It's important. Even though we're coming out of this pandemic, there's still a lot going on. And everybody needs to be there for each other and support each other. And that's what we're trying to do here for you too. So just remember, there's always hope. Thank you.